So good afternoon, everyone. This is the beginning of our second session for the day, where we'll be looking at resilience in supply chain, cybersecurity, and alliances and partnerships. First of all, thank you to the CCDCOE for inviting me and our fellow panelists for this almost painfully topical event and discussion. In the last 24 hours, we've had a significant set of signals, attributions and sanctions set by not just the United States, but NATO and the EU partners have also taken significant steps to align themselves to greater and lesser degrees with the statements coming out from the leading partner. I'm sure that will come up in this panel, but I'd like to first introduce the panelists with me today. First of all, we have Dr. Alan Friedman, who is currently the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the US Department of Commerce. Prior to working in the federal government, Dr. Friedman was a cybersecurity and technology policy researcher, working from both technologist and a policy scholar direction. So we're going to rely on him for a lot of the technological foundations upon which we build our following discussion today. We also have Mr. Neil Robinson, who is a senior policy officer at Cyber Defence NATO. Prior to that, he worked for 12 years at RAND Europe as a research leader. And finally, but by certainly no means least, we have Lisa Past, who is currently, I believe, her very last event, in fact, as part of Cybernetica, and will be returning to a different post, which I'm sure will present all sorts of new challenges. My main goal for today is actually to provide as much opportunity to discuss these issues as possible, so you'll hear very little of my voice for the next 40 minutes. I'm going to hand over to, in order of introductions, these three for their opening remarks and then to the floor for questions. If you do have any questions, please do leave them in the chat box attached to this call, and I will try and call out those that are of most hopeful use to us moving on at the end of the three sections of introductory remarks. So without further ado, Neil, I'd like to hand over to you if I could.
I think as the first panelist, Alexei, I'll talk on some questions of supply chain security, the unique nature of the supply chain security challenge for NATO, the sorts of tools that we have available. I'm very pleased Doug Jones mentioned the Cyber Defence Pledge, which obviously was covered also in detail yesterday, and then some sort of considerations on the way forward. And I'd like to start just with a very brief anecdote that at my first day practically at NATO many years ago, I was talking with one of the architects of NATO Cyber Defence over lunch, and he asked me what my priorities and interests and ideas were for policy change, and I ventured the idea of addressing the supply chain security challenge, which when he'd taken his drawer off the floor and finished laughing for a few minutes, made me realise just how complex and challenging this is. So, by way of a caveat, really, there's not any simple solutions. And the key message of my talk and my remarks will be that NATO needs to work. We will work across boundaries, across the civil and military interface, across public and private sector, to build and also crucially sustain trust. And this might require new forms of partnerships in places where necessarily they didn't exist before, and that's going to be challenging, but ultimately necessary. So in terms of the unique challenge of supply chain security for the alliance, we face some particular the architecture of the alliance it lends itself is particularly susceptible to supply chain issues, because we are not talking about homogeneous single organization. We rather characterize it more as an ecosystem, an alliance of 30 sovereign nations, but also an organization that runs operations and missions. And so when it comes to technologies, and specifically to communications and information systems, we see two different elements: the capabilities that allies bring to the table, and what NATO as an organisation deploys, for example, in theatre or on exercises. And managing risk across this boundary is quite complex, and where some systems may be under full NATO control, others might be operated by an ally or groups of allies on behalf of NATO, and others, even, for example, the Centre of Excellence, might even be fully outside the command structure. So for the alliance, questions of vulnerabilities in the supply chain go to the heart of this question of governance, management, and ownership of risk across this interface. So while part of the context revolves around the breadth, if you like, of addressing the supply chain issue across our partners, across allies, across the institutions ourselves, the other part also is around the depth. So how deep we can go in terms of assuring our supply chains. And accreditation has traditionally been the route and the way to address this. And accreditation must necessarily cover a number of issues, reflecting the diverse nature of the risks that we face in cyberspace. Three particular issues are the complexity, and I think these again just really echoing what was mentioned yesterday. The complexity of the supply chains, the modern supply chains that we have to cope with, the lack of understanding of what's in the box, and also lack of information on the pedigree of suppliers and the components, the provenance, as antique dealers might wish to characterize it. So this diverse kind of challenge really is where NATO comes in, because we are an organization set up with the aim of providing a platform for our members, allies, to come together, to talk, to exchange information, exchange best practices. More practically, as Lisa made the point yesterday, it's impossible for NATO as an organisation to scrutinise every single technology. And so this is where the risk management approach comes in, allowing us to effectively prioritise according to our understanding and analysis of the threat and the impact of particular vulnerabilities and the severity. I'll now talk a little bit around what we're doing about it, and I'm very glad to say that Doug Jones mentioned the Cyber Defence Pledge as a top-down instrument. Last year, particularly, we looked at the focus area of military cyber risk in military supply chains. And the idea of this was to both gather a landscape of where the allies were at in terms of addressing this, and also solicit some best practice, some good ideas. In addition, there's also the baseline requirements for national resilience, which are non-binding requirements reviewed periodically and cover steps each and every ally needs to take to bolster their national resilience across critical infrastructure sectors, healthcare, civil communications and energy, for example. And they've been also updated to cope with the 5G challenge and the foreign direct investment. And internally on our own systems, we've got rigorous accreditation processes. And for each ally, when an ally joins NATO, they have to go through a series of steps, meet certain minimum requirements in terms of their own systems. And really, it's about, I think, the role of NATO as a platform to share information, a venue where allies can bring their ideas, to raise the level of, raise the boat, everyone's raise the maturity of the alliance, and that's really also where the pledge comes in terms of being an instrument to articulate and to drive improvements across the allies, and also selling the idea of sharing information as being in everyone's interest. Some of the awareness-raising issues around supply chain security that we've been working on include security by design, getting security requirements in early, and treating them at the same level as functional requirements, not as an afterthought. Through life risk management, needing to revisit accreditation on the system as it is used, not as it's designed. Getting allies to appreciate security value trade-offs. Cheap and fast is not necessarily secure. And as again was said yesterday, you end up paying for security somewhere, and its prevention is always cheaper than mitigation. And finally, we try to also convey the importance of country agnostic approaches, and not just looking at, of course, as a political organisation, the geopolitical context is very important, but these tools need to be applicable across companies rather than targeted specific countries. And really, this goes again to the question of transparency, and predictability in the approaches that we have for understanding the provenance of these supply chain risks. We talked a little bit around yesterday defining trustworthiness, and again, that's something we've been working on internally, and understanding what kind of criteria we might look at. Is it the amount of money that the vendor spends on security, for example? Is it their security arrangements that might be set up? Some of these issues are really challenging to tackle. And there is the role for the market power of the alliance in terms of the brand of NATO as being a good place for industry to say, well, we're supplying products and services into NATO. It's a good reflection. Some thoughts about the future nature of cooperation. As the Deputy Secretary General said yesterday, cooperation is going to be really important, not just with our usual partners, non-NATO allies, for example, the European Union and the OSCE, but also some others, for example, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which has a role helping to stimulate security standards in industry, international standardisation bodies working on the technical standards, which I'm sure Alan will talk about, and then small to medium enterprises from the non-defence world, hot houses where these ideas and innovations on artificial intelligence, for example, are coming from. Also, perhaps the entertainment industry. I was struck by this conversation a few weeks ago around the deepfake, the Tom Cruise deepfake, which attracted a lot of media industry. So there's some partners that we're going to have to be, not the traditional NATO partners that we're going to have to be interacting with. And these partnerships are going to help us challenge deal with challenges such as the changing nature of innovation and the service and delivery models and implications for alliance and for particularly the military as we use and as the applications of 5G technology, for example, become more relevant for the military. Then this example particularly shows how the firms building the pipes are also operating the infrastructure as well. So it's not just a traditional service provider relationship, but that boundary is becoming more blurred. And the interdependencies between these forms of innovation as well. Data powers artificial intelligence, and that in turn makes the Internet of Things a reality. So where do you do security assurance? Where do you do the supply chain assurance across all that? And we also, there's a long, increasingly mature history now of understanding security issues on the cloud provision as well. So in closing, I'd like to echo comments made yesterday by someone on the importance of transparent approaches. Partnerships and cooperation to address supply chain risk are going to need to be much broader, earlier in the tech readiness phase, and also deeper to get meaningful assurance of the supply chain. And then we also, I think the point mentioned on language earlier as well, should be looking to employ language of confidence and assurance rather than a binary security or not secure, or not secure or not secure. And I'd like to finish with the old quote, trust but verify. I think this applies into the digital age just as much as it did to the Cold War. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'll move straight on without further ado, or my words, to Alan, if you wouldn't mind. I believe you have a few slides for us as well.
Sure. Thank you very much. And Neil set this up, I think, quite well, because we can go from talking about the importance at the high level and a broad picture about how we need transparency and cooperation. And what I can do is offer a specific example of how some progress has been made in that direction. So first, we'll start off by sort of scoping our problem, because, again, supply chain is a very big issue. So let's narrow it down to software. And we can focus on software because, one, that's the largest attack surface, and also I think that's one of the most unique areas that we have. That's the novel area. Now, software is not hewn out of alabaster on pretty islands by tonsured monks. It's assembled. And part of what we need to do is have some model of assembly and have visibility or transparency into that software supply chain. And that in turn sets up the risk-based discussion that Neil and some of the other speakers have talked about. And I think the model shouldn't surprise anyone. If you go to the store and you buy a Twinkie, for example, in America, one of our favorite non-biodegradable snacks, it will come with listed ingredients. Why don't we expect the same level of transparency, just that, as much as we get in a candy bar, in the supply chain of some of our most mission-critical systems? And by the way, some of you may not know this, the Twinkie is not vegetarian. Now, for many of us, that's completely fine, right? We are happy with that. But we all know someone who has a rule, a policy, a preference that makes that problematic. And really what transparency is about is enabling that sort of behavior to say, hey, everyone can make their own decisions. So what is a software bill of materials? A software bill of materials, here's a couple of definitions that have come out with this, but it's effectively this list of ingredients, or it's a formal record of the supply chain relationships of the components used in building software. Now, it's helpful to think about this in the life cycle of software. We wear different hats in the ecosystem. Some of us make software, right? We can't use it unless there are people who make it. And by the way, that's not just companies out there. Organizations make their own software as well. All of the militaries now have their own software development shops in-house. Some of us choose software, right? This is the point of selection, where I decide to buy something or use an open source component. And of course, many of us operate software. It's on our networks. We're depending on it. How do we manage it? SBOM won't solve any of these problems by itself, but it is integral to making progress, whether we want a more secure development process, better supply chain management, risk management, or vulnerability management across the life cycle. It's going to be absolutely key to have it. So what is this idea of an SBOM? Here's a toy example, and I'm trying to make sure that we're having a policy discussion, but it's helpful to think about this. In this little toy example, we have our Acme application. Acme application in turn depends on two components, Bingo Buffer and Bob's browser. And Bob's browser in turn depends on Carol's compression engine. So that's really all it is. It's just a tree diagram that says, what are the components? And for each of these components, the minimum we need to start on the pedigree and provenance that Neil talked about isn't that much. Who's the supplier? Where did this come from? Was it made by a company? Did it come from an open source project? What do we know about it? We can add more information on top of that. We can say this open source project is trusted. We don't know anything about this open source project. This company is based in this country. We can add more information, but the minimum is just where did it come from? Then we can do the analysis. Similarly, what's the component? What's the version? What's the hash of it, or the mathematical fingerprint? So you and I can both be sure that we're talking about the same version of software, so that I can feel confident that it's not a backdoored version that someone slipped into the supply chain. And who's the author of this data? Where did this come from? Did this come from the supplier? Did it come from a third-party expert? And again, that's starting us towards that trusted data. The last thing I'll flag here is we don't assume there's going to be perfect data. And one of the things this model allows is known unknowns. So in this case, for example, we know that Acme application has exactly two dependencies. We know that Carol's compression engine is the root of our tree. It doesn't have any further dependencies. We simply don't know in this example whether Bingo Buffer has any further dependencies. And that's okay because that information is transparent. Now, whoever's using this data can make a decision. Do I need to hire an investigator or a pen test? Do I need to go back to the supplier and say, give me more information? Or is this enough data for my level of risk and level of assurance? And that's the model here. So how have we been doing this? Because I also want to talk about the process, because it touches on things like public-private partnership that were brought up this morning, or earlier in this, morning, my time. And the approach here is, I think, really instrumental for understanding how we need to think about this, which is none of these problems are unique to not just NATO and the NATO community and the alliance, but they're not even unique to the defense community. The need to have transparency in the supply chain is critical for healthcare and energy and IT and communications, especially as we move to 5G. Now, these all have very real national security implications to defend our societies, but they're also important in the day-to-day operation of these communities. So we need to make sure that the solution is something that can work for all of these communities. And similarly, we need to understand the entire supply chain. If we only start with the end point of my use case, we won't understand the needs of further upstream. For example, almost all software today has some amount of open source in it. And that's great. That has enabled incredible amounts of innovation. And there are some benefits here. Open source, because it's public, allows us to monitor it and understand what risks might be emerging. We can throw a lot of great intelligence and artificial intelligence to monitor this and track commits and things like that. but the solutions that we propose need to reflect the reality of that community. And so what we've tried to do at NTIA over the last few years is build this open, transparent, international process that is open to everyone, is consensus-driven, and reflects the needs of the community. For those of you who come from a software world, there's a term called agile development. This is agile policy development, where we try something and we iterate and we continue again. We don't go off for 6 years to build the perfect standard and then come to the world and say, now everyone has to use it. We're trying things, we're iterating, we're moving quickly. If you'd like to know a little more, ntia.gov/SBOM. This really is something that is open to everyone, and we hope more people get involved because we think this is going to be a natural part of it. And a year or 3 from now, this shouldn't be any different than having a list of ingredients on your pack of candy that you go to the store, and we can move on to the next challenge. And I think this is the path forward. So happy to dive into some of the other technical challenges that we're going to be facing, and just the big picture of thinking about what are some of the novel ways that we can collaborate and bring in the technical expertise so that we're not building solutions that don't help the entire ecosystem.
That was a fantastic set of explanations of what was otherwise a very complex idea. I certainly like the idea of almost European-style food health warning on software products. It would make a lot of the discussions I've been having over certain telecommunications products in the UK a lot easier if it were quite that easy to see what's beyond the surface. So that sounds quite fascinating. And without further ado, and any more input from me, I'll move on to our final panelist. Lisa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And what a joy, honor, and privilege to be following the speakers of this panel and the previous panel, which gives me the luxury of taking the pragmatic approach. And since none of us are admiring the problem of inevitability of dealing with supply chain, and as statements from the White House yesterday highlighted, the inevitability of needing to understand what goes into our technology. However, it's not an easy or simple task, since as societies and also defense forces depend not just on vendors, as was highlighted particularly by Alan just a few minutes ago, but also on the civilian infrastructure and therefore their vendors and vendors of their vendors. So we're still at the point where we're looking to lay tracks for a more secure world where there's greater transparency and visibility. But currently, and I tip my hat to the SBOM initiative in particular, we're in the world of unknown unknowns, where organizations run tech stacks that they don't understand, and the system administrator who knows what the update schedule is no longer works for us, let alone the system architect who put those boxes in there. So in a lot of ways, even critical infrastructure, to a degree, still lives on a legacy of black boxes that at the time of purchase might have been from the top shelf and the best and the brightest. But there are several, not just SBOM, but several other initiatives that I think are worthwhile and that can work well for us as nations, as corporations, and also as the alliance. The first of them are particular approaches, whether it's the SBOM or whether it's cryptographic code assurance approaches. But those demand a degree of compliance or at least participation from those down the supply chain, which can be tricky again, as very quickly, once you get to the elements of elements, you get into tens, possibly hundreds and thousands of vendors and their suppliers. And code, particularly code that gets lazily implemented and sometimes recycled without much thought. If you look at some of the most critical audit of, let's say, election software, something I've looked into a lot during my career, the most typical criticism isn't that someone's been malicious or someone's done something wrong, but it's that whoever was trying to implement complex mathematics, particularly cryptographic solutions, really has no idea how complex mathematics works or how it should be implemented. So with these particular approaches, there is the question of, do we have an ecosystem maturity that already gets us, that is enough to start to implement particular approaches to supply chain assurance? Secondly, and Neil pointed towards the direction of accreditation. And I would lump with accreditation also certification and standardization, which is a great way to make sure that we all have an accreditation almost checklist, because that's what accreditation is, checklist. Does this technology fulfill these requirements? Or a standardization profile, a certification profile. But the issue there is that none of these are cheap or quick, which means that on a very practical level, as security managers, CISOs, and IT leaders are stuck with an impossible dilemma of accredited and certified versus secure. Since these processes take usually hundreds of thousands and a couple quarters at least, so at least 6 months or so. And that, at that point, the standard has to be in place, the accreditation profile has to be in place. So you're really accrediting or standardizing against something that's at least a year old by the time you receive your accreditation or standardization. The third approach is that of assessing trust and reliability of a vendor, or whatever else you depend on. So it can be also trust and reliability of a digital services ecosystem that your services universally rely on. And in doing that, I think we've actually figured out the technical angle most. And the 5G conversation highlights where the strengths are. The 5G conversation shows that with effort, there are governments that can, in fact, accredit and certify 5G equipment. But equally to that, you have, in terms of assessing trust and reliability, you have to look into the economic and rule of law type of arguments. Can we be certain that further upstream, the company that's providing your technology will not be in some way influenced outside of rule of law by intelligence agencies? Do we understand who their owners are? Do they respect IP, or do they just steal our trade secrets to save on their own R&D? That's the wider sort of framework that we have to look at when we take a reliability or trustworthiness approach. And finally, again, Neil talked about information sharing already. And what we learned, and what also the 2017 Estonian ID card vulnerability showed, where a vendor had a lazy engineering applying the best of market crypto library in a way where randomness ran out of randomness quicker than we rather would have wanted, is that the information sharing has to be actionable and useful. It's not enough to share information to say, as happened for the eIDAS mechanism of notification for electronic identity in Europe, that cards in a certain country with a certain card application have a vulnerability, when the vulnerability, in fact, was inside of the firmware that everyone shared. 2 billion chips with that firmware out there in the wild. So with those 4 considerations, lots of great ideas, but no silver bullet.
Thank you very much, all 3 of the panelists, for a rather fascinating multi-level look at the issue that we're facing around supply chains, but also some of the approaches taken to manage this very current issue. It's obviously not one that anyone in this room, I would hope, thinks is new, but it's certainly one which has been thrust into the limelight and made far more, I wouldn't say interesting, but more pertinent than it has perhaps been for quite some time. I have one question of my own I'd like to pose to all 3 panelists before I open up to the audience and see where they go. And it's essentially a two-phase question that has to do with the capacity and cost of the accreditation and standardization that we're proposing here as a route through. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly in the US market, as to who should bear the cost of essentially changing practice in order to secure supply chains. Now, the question I ask is, first of all, is there an outbalanced cost to particularly small to medium enterprises that might have an impact upon innovation, which we now understand, both according to the UK's integrated review, but also the US, are pushing innovation and technology as a critical part of their security policy. And in broader terms in the alliance space, what can the alliance, NATO and others that we have do to increase the capacity of states, allies, and other partners of different types to meet these costs in order to achieve the end goal we're looking at securing essentially supply chains through the standardization and accreditation process? So I'd like to go in order that the panelists presented and give some of you more time than others to consider the answer. But so that would begin with you, Neil, if you could.
So I'll take a go at at your second question, Alexei, and what can the alliance do to increase the capacity of partners? And I think here, I mean, we have a number of capacity building tools that we deploy. Trust funds, for example, training of partners. It's not speaking as much to the issue of directly funding countries to work on supply chains or indeed industry, but it is the support that we're able to give additionally through the Science for Peace and Security program, which helps again to kind of build human capacity. I think one of the things that I'm always keen to point out when we're talking about cyber defense issues is the need to think in balance around the three components of doing things properly are people, process, and technology. So whilst I know one of the questions was on the kind of on the technology side, when we speak about capacity building, it also should be aimed at human capacity. So getting the training and education, raising the awareness of partners, of all other organisations that we interact with. And so I think that's a key thing that the alliance is able to do. And again, I go back to my sort of point around NATO being a sort of the brand of the alliance being very powerful in that regard, and something that helps to communicate the importance of an issue if it's something that the allies are taking an interest in nationally, which is what the pledge is about, but also through doing so under a kind of NATO umbrella, and how that helps to kind of convey the message politically, at least, to kind of partners and outside the alliance as such. And then I think in terms of more generally the cost of supply chain, and you touched upon this kind of innovation security trade-off. I think again, that's a kind of really interesting question, and not for NATO as an organisation, but national governments certainly potentially there is a role for them to step in to say, well, if you're a small to medium enterprise that is doing some innovation, maybe there's an opportunity there for the government to public sector to kind of assume some of the costs, just in a hypothetical example, for addressing those security issues, to let the company, let the individuals get on with the kind of business of doing the innovating. But it's not an easy issue, and I think as I mentioned again, you have to pay for security is a cost somewhere along the line, wherever either at the start or as we've sort of seen with the whole SolarWinds discussion in terms of when you get confronted by these issues of like how deeply do we need to rebuild things once we have this kind of compromise, do we start again, and that's that's a really big cost, and not something that pales in comparison to to the minor costs of just doing the prevention, building the human capacity, as well as getting the technologies and the capabilities in place.
Oh, thank you, Neil. That's a great answer. I think you're right. If security were free, most of us would not be in much work right now. So in a way, we've got to look at some positive. So I'll turn that over to Alan if you've got a response to the same set of questions.
Sure, and I'll focus on the cost side. My background's in engineering, but my PhD is actually in applied economics. And so one of the basic tenets of economics is the cost is a function of elasticity of demand. And so there are going to be certain areas where it's going to be borne in certain types of competitive marketplaces. In the national security world, you only have one actor. And I'm sure there are some good economists in the audience who focus on this that can write a very interesting paper on it. So please write that so that we can cite you. On the specific question of small and medium enterprises, this is actually an area where if we frame things right, we might be able to leverage the smaller organizations. Because especially in the technical and software domain, they tend to have more modern build pipelines. And they have more modern tools, whereas older organizations tend to have more complicated legacy environments that require a little more effort to demonstrate and to pull artifacts out of to show this. Whereas modern tools for building both software and hardware often enable certain types of assurance. So that's actually one area that might be at the advantage of this. And that speaks to two other points that relate to this. First is the cost of measurement. And that's one of my personal passions in security, is there's a lot of things that we know we need to care about. And some of it we don't have an option, right? This is some things we need to care about. But if we have the ability to prioritize, I think it makes sense to start with the things that are relatively easy to measure and relatively cheap to measure. And, as an example, I'll call out colleagues in the UK government who've been focusing on IoT, just again for the civilian marketplace, where they said, let's look at simple things like default credentials. Do you have them? Do you have coordinated vulnerability disclosure replacement? These are all things that are relatively easy for either the government to measure or a third party in the marketplace to measure. And that sets up the last question that was actually raised in the chat by, forgive me for butchering your name, Mina Lusta Juha, which is a lot of these problems are what we can think of as write once problems, where not everyone has to do the same work over and over again. Now, this is not a unique problem in security. It's something that the US government has had to face with cloud services. And the solution that we came up with, called FedRAMP, is functional, but probably one of the less popular cybersecurity regulations and standardizations out there. So there are ways to do it well. And another thing that we can think about doing is, since a lot of this work is going to be done by the private sector, to do that first wave of expert attestation, what can we do to make sure that there are incentives to share this data, that it's seen as both a public good and a private good? I don't have the answer to that, but that's going to be something that we're going to want to try to incentivize.
Thank you very much, Alan, for one, answering the question I posed and then going to the chat and doing some of my job for me. So that always makes my life much easier. And that brings us finally to Lisa, if you've got any take on the questions I posed, or indeed any that you've spotted in the chat as we go.
Well, boy, oh boy, I do have several 90-minute lectures prepared on all about 6 of the questions raised here, but I also do realize that we're one of the very last things between most of our listeners and their Friday evening plans. So 3 points to raise. First of all, the unique and incredibly valuable role of the alliance is increasing the political cost of adversarial activity on supply chain. Now, something that we have a great case of from less than 24 hours ago. And you can go into the scholastics and proportionality of the response and whether it is productive for future deterrence for deterring rather adversarial operations in cyberspace, that this response, that is a more convincing response than many others we've seen, frankly, across the last decade, was lumped together with the responses to much more severe adversarial activity. No, the SolarWinds Orion hack was serious, but a lot of its seriousness was not in the impact, but in the potential that wasn't fully used. And we are dealing with responses, as I said, lumped together to a lot of adversarial activity. And that's number one, then NATO's role in increasing the cost of adversarial activity through responses, sanctions, blacklists, what have you. And doing that in not necessarily as an alliance, but as allies in a somewhat coordinated manner. Secondly, let's face it, not all governments are created equal in terms of their ability to accredit and to standardize. That's the reality. There are governments that have accreditation labs bigger than all of the Estonian government's IT institutions all together. And I'm not just looking at Germany. So there's definitely a lot to be done as both allies and an alliance in terms of being able to translate each other's work into our own domestic contexts and our own political as well as IT security policy context. And there's a fair amount of effort going on the EU side, and it makes absolutely no sense why NATO should not be doing similar work, particularly as the United States is among those most capable of allies. And thirdly, then, Alexei, to your question about the small and medium organizations, not just enterprises, but in this international relations and international technical aid as well as defense world, there's also a fair amount of non-commercial, non-governmental organizations doing work, particularly in post-conflict reconstruction. And their cybersecurity is at least as important as it also speaks to the legacy that's left behind after military operations. And in there, I think there's a lot to be learned from what's being done with information security standards and then cutting them down for controls for smaller organizations. The CIS control seems to be emerging as one of the leaders in that space, as you get the CIS top 20 as well as the full list of CIS controls, which eventually can build up to, let's say, whether it's the Grundschutz or whether, pardon my German again, or whether it's to ISO 27000 series. And I think breaking down accreditation the same way is incredibly useful.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. I know that we have potentially less than 40 seconds left on my clock, at which point I'm simply going to thank everyone for their time, the organizations for involving me in today's events and, in fact, organizing the event itself. It's been fascinating. I do wish perhaps next time we have more than 24 hours notice before a major attribution takes place and we have a talk about that very subject. But as someone said earlier before, this is an opportunity perhaps to really get the point across, and when else is it going to happen? So thank you all of the panelists, and I'd like, if we could, to have a digital thanks in the chat or elsewhere, but it's been a pleasure and I hope to do this again sometime soon, maybe with actual physical interaction rather than just a digital one.
Good afternoon. Now I'm the last one standing between you and your Friday. Honorable audiences, I'm Colonel Yaktarian. For the last almost 3 years, I've had the honor to serve as the director for this wonderful, bright team called NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Center of Excellence. Now, in my previous life in the Air Force, I figured out that my key for success in leadership is to gather a team of people smarter than you and listen to them. Here in this role, I've also learned that it's important to read without mistakes the bright words that are written for you and improvise as little as possible. It's been an extremely busy cyber week in Estonia. The center ran the world's largest cyber defense exercise, Locked Shields, and also Estonian MOD hosted the Cyber Pledge conference. Now, you probably followed very closely the Cyber Pledge conference, so let me tell you about the cyber battles going on at the NATO Cyber Range. Locked Shields has grown in its about 10 years of history to be the world's largest and most complex technical live-fire cyber exercise. The complexity is illustrated by a fun story I learned this morning. You know, Estonian Ministry of Defense that hosts the NATO Cyber Range, they had recently upgraded the range to be able to in the future accommodate, instead of current 24 team slots for locked shields, to 32. And our technical team this morning reported that the range was amazing this time. We never ran out of computing power. We ran it to 100%, but we never ran out. And I said, wait. You mean you still had 1/3 in excess, right, in reserve? And the technicians were kind of like, what? Well, no, and we ran it to maximum. So hey, world is getting more complex. We're using all the server room there is. But our team gave excellent training, the real world-like training, to 22 national teams, usually comprised of their best experts from their certs and private sector. Amongst other targets, locked shields always feels real world-like systems. Like with the help of Siemens, we have a real power grid and power grid software. With the help of Ericsson, we have real mobile communication network. With the help of small Estonian company SpaceIT, or Space IT, we have a satellite link software to be defended. We had air defense network with the help of Brazilian companies that I've forgotten the names of. And water purification plants, many vital systems of national security and critical national infrastructure that best cyber defenders in the 22 participating teams had to successfully defend against one very professional red team that attacked them all. We don't like to keep locked shields as competition, but if you award feedback points in exercise, there is a human tendency to start competing. So the highest feedback point team always gets a trophy, and they are very, very proud of that. So this year, the honor goes to Team Sweden. Congratulations, the winners of Locked Shields 2021. Now, this side event today brought together experts across all society and alliances. We have participants from universities, research institutions, think tanks, government, military, EU, NATO bodies. We also had journalists, general public. You booked it full. Our platform ran out of space, so we are also broadcasting live on YouTube, on our CCDCOE YouTube channel. Now, in today's security environment, things happen simultaneously. Today's discussion was also informed about yesterday's events when President of the United States, Mr. Biden, issued the executive order establishing sanctions to Russia for their hacks of SolarWind and meddling in the US elections. And also the European High Commissioner, Mr. Borrell, or High Representative, expressed solidarity to the United States and the impact of SolarWind cyber operation. Those operations were attributed by the United States to Russia. It is an important step. These statements show that the alliance, the EU, and the community of democratic nations are responding firmly and jointly to irresponsible state behavior in cyberspace. To do so even more effectively, we need to improve information sharing across the alliance and with like-minded partners and craft jointly timely and credible responses. Strengthening of national cyber resiliency through the Cyber Defence Pledge commitments and responding to malicious cyber activities in a timely manner is impossible without the continuous and close collaboration with our partners. Now, in this regard, I'm really glad to say that our CCDCOE, which first C stands for cooperation, characterizes cooperation and information sharing across all our member nations, which extends broader than the alliance. We are counting 35 nations right now that are closely associated, if not full members of the CCDCOE. We thank all our member nations for being with us and improving the information sharing and cooperation for a safer cyberspace. Hereby, I'd like to thank all who participated in this event, our long-term collaboration partners, William and Mary, King's College London, who have made this event possible, and the support of the United States mission to NATO. We had brilliant speakers and our excellent moderators, Dr. Missiroli and Dr. Drew. Thank you. Our researcher, Piret Pernik, worked so hard to organize and put this event on. She's there waving, shy as always, but trust me, she worked really hard. We intend to continue discussions on the NATO's role in cyber defense in the new decade. Please feel free to download the volume Cyber Threats and NATO 2030, Horizon Scanning and Analysis. It is free on our webpage, ccdcoe.org. Now with that, this is it. It is Friday evening, so goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you on our next landmark event, CyCon Conference, end of May. See you there. Thank you. Goodbye.